Help! Somebody help! The cry ripped through the storm, sharp with pain and panic. Please help. It hurts. Annie flinched so hard she nearly dropped the shovel. She stood frozen for half a heartbeat, the sound echoing in her ears. Then she ran. Snow grabbed at her boots, the wind pushing her sideways as she followed the voice toward the back of the street. When she reached the driveway, she stopped short. A car lay upside down, its wheels pointing uselessly at the sky. Snow pressed against the metal like a heavy blanket, already creeping up the sides. Beneath it, half buried and struggling, was a man. He groaned as Annie skidded to her knees beside him. One leg was trapped under the edge of the overturned car. His body twisted at an angle that made her stomach tighten. His breath came fast and uneven, white clouds puffing into the air. "Mister," Annie shouted, "don't move." He turned his head toward her, eyes wide and unfocused. "Kid, thank God. I can't get out. I'm here," Annie said quickly, the words spilling over each other. "I'm here. You're not alone." She grabbed his arm with both hands and pulled. Nothing happened. She pulled harder, planting her boots in the snow, her face burning with effort. The man cried out, pain cutting through his voice. "Stop, stop," he gasped. "It's stuck." Annie let go immediately, her heart hammering. She knelt closer, brushing snow from his face with shaking fingers. "I'm sorry," she said. "I just wanted to help." "You are helping," he said, forcing a breath. "You shouldn't be out here. Where are your parents?" "My mom's close," Annie replied. She looked at the car again, at the way the metal pinned him down. She knew then, with a certainty that felt too big for her chest, that she couldn't do this alone. "It's going to be okay," she said, leaning close so he could hear her over the wind. "Please stay awake. I'm going to get my mom. I'll be right back, I promise." "Mine too." He reached out weakly, his fingers brushing her sleeve. Don't leave." "I won't," Annie said firmly. "I'm fast." She pulled her scarf from around her neck and wrapped it around his shoulder, tucking it in the best she could. Then she looked him straight in the eyes, the way her mother did when something was important. "Count with me," she said. "Slow. 1, 2, 3. Keep counting until I come back." He nodded, jaw clenched. 1, he whispered. Annie turned and ran. The snow felt deeper now, the wind louder, but she didn't slow down. She didn't think about slipping or falling. All she could think about was her mother's face, the way it tightened when Annie was hurt, the way it softened when someone needed help. She burst through their front door, breathless. "Mom!" Her mother looked up from the stove, alarm flashing across her tired eyes. "Annie? What's wrong?" "There's a man," Annie said, words tumbling over each other. "His car flipped. He's stuck in the snow. He's hurt. I tried, but I can't pull him out." Her mother didn't ask questions. She didn't stop to grab her coat neatly or turn off the light. She pulled on boots, wrapped a scarf around her head, and took Annie's shoulders in her hands. "Show me," she said. They ran back into the storm together. When they reached the driveway, the man was still there, his lips moving silently as he counted. His eyes flicked up when he saw them. "Thank you," he breathed. "Thank you. I come then 12th coming placed of gutted." Annie's mother knelt beside him, her movements calm and practiced despite the cold. She assessed the car, the angle of his body, the trapped leg. "Sir," she said, her voice steady. "I'm going to help you, but you have to listen to me. Don't fight me." He nodded weakly. She positioned herself, braced her feet, and nodded at Annie. Annie grabbed his arm again, her small hands tight. 1, her mother said. 2, 3. They pulled together. The man screamed. Then the pressure gave way. His legs slid free from under the car, and he collapsed against them. Shaking, Annie nearly fell backward from the sudden release, but her mother caught him, holding his weight with a strength that surprised Annie even though it shouldn't have. "Easy," her mother murmured. "Easy. You're out." The man sagged, breath coming in ragged sobs. I thought no one would come." Annie wiped snow from his face again. "I told you," she said softly. "I came back." They got him to his feet slowly, carefully. He leaned heavily on Annie's mother, his arms slung around her shoulders. "Our house is close," her mother said. "We'll warm you up and clean those cuts." He hesitated, shame flickering across his face. "I don't want to be trouble." "You're not," she replied simply. "You're hurt." Step by step, they guided him away from the wreck, away from the cold metal and the snow that wanted to pull him back down. Annie stayed on his other side, her shoulder under his arm, her small body determined. When they reached the house, warmth rushed out to meet them. Annie's mother sat him down, wrapped him in blankets, and pressed a bowl of hot soup into his hands. "Drink," she said. The man obeyed, color slowly returning to his face. He looked at Annie then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said quietly. Annie shrugged, her hands still shaking from the cold. "Yes, I did," she replied. The house was quiet in the way poor houses often were, not silent, but careful. The old heater clicked and sighed in the corner, working harder than it should have. The smell of soup lingered in the air, simple and comforting, the kind made from whatever was left in the pantry, and a lot of patience. The man sat on the narrow couch, wrapped in blankets that didn't quite match. One was faded blue, another thin and brown at the edges. His shoes had been set by the door, still dusted with snow. Annie's mother had cleaned the blood from his leg as gently as she could, her hands steady, her voice low and calm the entire time. "Does it hurt when I touch here?" she had asked. "Yes," he'd answered honestly. "That's good," she'd said. "It means you can feel it." Now he held the bowl with both hands, steam fogging his face as he sipped. Each swallow seemed to anchor him a little more to the room, to the warmth, to the fact that he was still alive. Annie sat on the floor a few feet away, knees tucked to her chest, watching him closely. She hadn't taken off her coat yet. Snow had melted into dark patches along the sleeves, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes followed every movement he made, as if she were afraid he might disappear if she looked away. "You can take your coat off," her mother said gently. "You'll catch a cold." Annie hesitated, then slowly shrugged it off and laid it beside her. Her fingers were red and swollen from the cold. The man noticed. He shifted on the couch, wincing slightly, and looked at her. "You shouldn't have been out there tonight," he said, not unkindly. "It was dangerous." Annie's shoulders stiffened. Before she could answer, her mother spoke. "She knows," she said. "But knowing doesn't stop the bills." The man nodded, absorbing that. He glanced around the room, the cracked linoleum floor, the small table with one unsteady leg, the family photos taped to the wall because there were no frames. Everything was clean. Everything was worn. "I'm William," he said after a moment. "William Hart." Annie blinked. She wasn't used to adults telling her their names first. "I'm Annie," she replied. "That's my mom." Her mother smiled politely. "You can call me Rosa." "Thank you," William said. "Both of you. I don't think I would have made it through the night." Rosa waved the words away with a small motion of her hand. "Eat first. Talking can wait." He obeyed. When the bowl was empty, she took it from him and replaced it with a mug of hot water. "Small sips," she instructed. "Shock doesn't always look the way people think." William did as he was told. He noticed then how tired she looked. Not just end-of-the-day tired, but the deeper kind. The kind that came from years of pushing through pain because there was no other option. "You're very calm," he said quietly. Most people would have panicked. Rosa met his eyes. "Panic doesn't help children," she said. "Or men trapped in the snow." That earned a small, strained smile from him. Annie shifted on the floor. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked. William looked at her. Really looked at her. The seriousness in her face. The worry she hadn't quite learned how to hide. "I think so," he said. "Thanks to you." She nodded once, satisfied with that answer. Rosa stood. "You should lie down," she said. "At least until the storm passes completely." "I don't want to impose," William began. "You're already here," she replied. "Lying down won't make it worse." She guided him to the small bed in the corner, the one Annie usually slept in. Annie watched, then spoke up. "I can sleep on the floor," she said quickly. "I do it sometimes." Rosa shook her head. You'll sleep in my bed tonight, she said. That's not a discussion. Annie opened her mouth, then closed it again. She knew when not to argue. William lowered himself carefully onto the bed, grimacing. Rosa adjusted the pillows and blankets, then stepped back. If the pain gets worse, you tell me, she said. If you feel sleepy, you fight it. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. It is. The word surprised her. She paused, then gave a small, approving nod. Annie lingered near the bed. I told you I'd come back, she said softly. William's throat tightened. You did, he replied. You kept your promise. She studied his face, as if measuring him against something only she could see. Then she seemed to relax a little. The storm raged on outside. But inside the house, time slowed. Rosa moved quietly, cleaning up, preparing more soup just in case. Annie eventually curled up on her mother's bed, exhaustion finally claiming her small body. William lay awake longer. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of a house settling, of a child breathing softly in the next room, of a woman moving through her life without complaint. His leg throbbed, but it was a distant pain compared to the weight pressing on his chest. He thought about the neighbors who hadn't stayed, about the security systems, the cameras, the gate that surrounded his mansion like armor, and how none of it had saved him when he lay trapped in the snow. It had been a child. A 6-year-old girl with cold hands and a stubborn sense of right and wrong. For the first time in years, William Hart fell asleep without the help of medication. No pills, no numbing fog, just the steady knowledge that someone, somewhere in the world, had decided he was worth saving. If this story touched something in you, please take a moment to show your support. Tap like, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe stories like this matter, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. And in the small house, under thin blankets, Annie slept deeply, unaware that the night she had thought would be just another storm had already begun to change everything. Morning arrived quietly, the way it often did after a long storm, as if the night had exhausted itself and could no longer make noise. Pale winter light slipped through the thin curtains, settling gently on the worn furniture and the small kitchen table where yesterday's mail still lay unopened. William woke slowly. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling above him was low, unfamiliar, faintly stained near one corner. The air smelled like soap and something warm vegetables. Maybe onions. Not disinfectant. Not polished wood. Not the sharp, sterile scent of his own house. He shifted slightly and winced. His leg protested immediately, a deep ache reminding him of the night before. Memory returned in fragments. Snow, pain, the sound of his own voice shouting into the dark, and then a small face framed by a scarf. Eyes far too serious for a child. Annie. He pushed himself up carefully, sitting on the edge of the bed. A blanket slipped to the floor. He bent to pick it up, then stopped when a wave of dizziness washed over him. Easy. Rosa stood in the doorway, already dressed for the day, her hair pulled back, a mug in her hand. She watched him the way nurses did, alert, measuring, calm. You shouldn't get up so fast, she said. Sit. Drink this. She handed him the mug. It was tea. Weak, but hot. I'm sorry, William said automatically. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Rosa leaned against the doorframe. You didn't, she replied. Life does that on its own. He sipped the tea. His hands were steadier than he expected. Where's Annie? He asked. Rosa nodded toward the kitchen. Eating. Before school, as if summoned by her name, Annie appeared in the doorway, her backpack already slung over one shoulder. She stopped short when she saw him sitting up. You're awake, she said. I am, William replied. Thanks to you. Aziz. She accepted that without comment. Mom says, you have to walk slow today, she informed him. And you're not allowed to go outside. Rosa raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Annie nodded firmly. You fell. That means rules. William laughed softly, then caught himself as his leg reminded him of its condition. I suppose I deserve that. Rosa glanced at the clock. We need to go, she said. School doesn't wait for storms. Annie hesitated. She looked at William, then at her mother. He won't disappear, right? The question landed heavier than it sounded. William felt something tighten in his chest. "No," he said. "I won't. I promise." Annie studied him for a second longer, then nodded once, satisfied. She pulled on her coat and boots, her movements quick and practiced. Rosa paused at the door. "There's soup on the stove," she told William, "and a phone if you need it. Rest." "I will," he said. "Thank you. For everything." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself," she replied. "Next time, don't walk alone in a storm." When the door closed behind them, the house felt suddenly larger, quieter. William sat there for a long moment, listening to the distant sound of footsteps fading down the street. He stood carefully and made his way to the small kitchen. The soup was still warm. He poured himself a bowl and sat at the table, noticing details he hadn't the night before. The faint crack in the wall repaired with tape. The grocery list stuck to the fridge with a chipped magnet. Annie's spelling homework spread neatly beside a pencil worn down to a stub. He ate slowly. His phone was still in his coat pocket. When he pulled it out, the screen lit up with missed calls and messages. Assistants, security, board members. The world he belonged to had been looking for him all night. He didn't call back right away. Instead, he stared at the screen, then turned the phone off and set it aside. For the first time in years, he had the space to think without interruption. And what he thought about wasn't the accident, or the storm, or even the pain in his leg. It was the look on Annie's face when she asked if he would disappear. By late morning, his strength had returned enough for him to stand without swaying. He cleaned the mug, wiped the counter, and carefully folded the blanket he'd used. He didn't want to leave the house as he had found it, as if it had only been a place to pass through. When Rosa and Annie returned in the afternoon, he was waiting. Annie spotted him first. "You're still here," she said, relief plain in her voice. "I said I would be," he replied. Rosa took in the scene: the folded blanket, the clean mug, the soup reheated on the stove. Something softened in her eyes. "You should go home," she said. "Your family must be worried." William nodded. "They are," he said. "But before I do, I want you to know something." They listened. "I don't usually make promises," he continued, "but I keep the ones I do make. I won't forget what you did for me, either of you." Rosa studied him carefully. "We didn't do it for anything," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why it matters." Well, he left not long after, walking slowly down the street, his legs still stiff but holding. Annie watched from the doorway until he disappeared around the corner. That evening, as Rosa tucked her into bed, Annie asked quietly, "Do you think he's really okay?" Rosa smoothed her hair. "I think," she said, "that some people don't realize how close they are to falling until someone small reaches out to stop them." Annie considered that. "I'm not that small," she said. Rosa smiled. "No," she agreed. "You're not." Outside, the snow began to melt, leaving behind wet pavement and the faint outlines of tire tracks, proof that something had happened there, even if the storm had tried to erase it. The days after the storm settled into a rhythm that felt familiar on the surface, yet subtly altered underneath, like a street that looked the same but sounded different once the snow had melted. Annie returned to school, Rosa returned to her shifts and careful budgeting, and the neighborhood returned to its habit of passing by without looking too closely. But Annie noticed. She noticed how people spoke a little more quietly when they mentioned the accident behind the mansion, how the overturned car was gone by the next afternoon. The snow scraped away so cleanly it was as if nothing had ever happened there at all. She noticed how the neighbors who had shut their doors that night now avoided meeting her eyes when she walked past with her backpack bouncing against her back. At school, her teacher asked her to write about the storm. Most of the children wrote about snowmen and canceled classes, about hot chocolate and staying inside. Annie stared at her paper for a long time. When she finally put pencil to page, she didn't write about snow at all. She wrote about a man who couldn't get up, and about hands that were cold but didn't let go. She didn't turn it in. After school, she still went out with her shovel when the sidewalks needed clearing. The work was lighter now, but the habit remained. A few doors opened, a few didn't. A few people paid her without a word. A few told her she should be home doing homework instead. She nodded to all of them and kept moving. At home, Rosa moved more slowly than usual. The storm had taken something out of her. Or maybe it had simply reminded her how thin the line was between holding things together and watching them fall apart. "You don't have to go out tonight," she told Annie one evening, rubbing her temples. "We'll be fine." Annie hesitated. "Just one house," she said. "Just in case." Rosa sighed but didn't argue. She knew her daughter well enough to understand when a decision had already been made. That same evening, several miles away, William Hart sat at the long dining table in his mansion, untouched plates cooling in front of him. The house was quiet in the way expensive houses often were, echoing, deliberate, lonely. His leg was bandaged now, properly examined by doctors who spoke in calm voices and avoided his eyes when they mentioned how close things had been. He listened to them with the same expression he wore in boardrooms, nodding, asking precise questions, absorbing information without comment. But when he was alone, the questions changed. He replayed the night again and again, not as a man reviewing a mistake, but as someone trying to understand a truth that had slipped past him for years. He thought about the cameras on his property that had captured the accident in perfect clarity and the delay between the crash and any meaningful response. He thought about the neighbors who had come close enough to see, and then far enough to forget. And he thought about Annie, about the way she had looked at him without fear or reverence, without curiosity about who he was or what he owned. She had seen only a man who needed help. Nothing more, nothing less. William called his assistant the next morning. "I need information," he said, quietly. "About the accident?" she asked. "About the girl," he replied. The pause on the other end of the line was brief but telling. "I'll see what I can do. Don't involve the media," William added, "and don't make this into charity." "Yes, sir." He hung up and stared out the tall windows at the winter-bare trees lining his driveway. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like control. It felt like judgment. Back in the small house, Rosa opened a letter she hadn't been expecting. It wasn't official looking, but it wasn't casual either. No return address, just her name, written neatly. She read it once. Then again. Annie watched her mother's face change, confusion giving way to concern. "What is it?" Annie asked. Rosa folded the letter carefully. "Someone wants to talk," she said. "About the other night." Annie's stomach tightened. "Did we do something wrong?" Rosa knelt in front of her, hands warm and firm on Annie's shoulders. "No," she said. "We did what was right." That night, Annie lay awake longer than usual. She thought about promises and disappearances, about how people could be present one moment and gone the next. She wondered if William would really remember them once the pain faded and life returned to normal. Outside, a car slowed briefly in front of the house, then moved on. Annie watched from behind the curtain until its taillights disappeared. Across town, William made a decision. He stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his coat, studying the man, staring back at him. 40 years old, successful, respected, and, he realized, profoundly indebted in a way no ledger could record. He picked up his phone and sent a single message. Tomorrow. The word carried more weight than he expected, because tomorrow meant showing up. Not as a benefactor, not as a headline, but as a man willing to be seen by the people who had seen him at his weakest and turned toward him instead of away. In the small house, Annie finally drifted to sleep, unaware that the quiet stretch of days was nearing its end, and that the promise she had taken at face value was already beginning to move, slowly and deliberately, back toward her. The knock came just after noon, sharp and deliberate, cutting cleanly through the quiet of the small house. Rosa froze with a dish towel in her hands. Annie, sitting at the table coloring, looked up immediately. They exchanged a glance, quick, practiced, the kind shared by people who learned early to read silence for warning signs. "I'll get it," Rosa said, though her voice carried a caution she didn't try to hide. She opened the door only halfway. Two men stood on the porch. Both wore dark coats, clean boots, and expressions that didn't belong in that neighborhood. One was younger, holding a slim folder close to his chest. The other was older, broader, with the posture of someone used to standing between danger and the people who paid him. "Yes?" Rosa asked. "Mrs. Alvarez?" the younger man said politely. Rosa stiffened. "Who's asking?" My name is Thomas Reed. This is Mr. Collins. He gestured briefly to the man beside him. We're here on behalf of William Hart. The name landed heavily in the space between them. Annie stood up behind her mother, peering around her arm. Her eyes widened. He said he wouldn't disappear, Annie whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Rosa didn't move aside. Is he all right? She asked. Yes, Reed answered. He's recovering well. He wanted us to come personally. Personally for what? Rosa said. To thank you, Reed replied. And to ask permission to speak with you. At a few miles, Rosa considered them for a long moment. She took in the lack of raised voices, the absence of flashing cameras, the careful distance they kept from the doorway. Finally, she stepped back. 5 minutes, she said. You can come in. They entered, removing their coats without being asked, careful not to track snow or dirt across the floor. Collins remained standing near the door, alert but respectful. Reed took a seat when Rosa gestured toward the chair. Annie didn't sit. She stood close to her mother, fingers curled into the fabric of Rosa's sweater. Mr. Hart asked us to deliver this, Reed said, placing the folder on the table but not opening it, before anything else. Rosa didn't touch it. We didn't do anything for money, she said flatly. Reed nodded. He knows. That's why he asked us not to bring any. That surprised her. He wanted to know if he could come by himself, Reed continued. No press. No announcements. Just to speak with you. And Annie, end quote. Annie swallowed. Is he hurt? She asked. Reed smiled gently. Not anymore. Rosa looked down at her daughter, then back at the men. When? This afternoon, Reed said. If that's all right. Rosa hesitated. Her instincts had kept her alive this long, and they were speaking loudly now. But so was another voice, the one that remembered the way William had looked at Annie when he thanked her, the way he had listened. All right, she said finally. But we decide when it ends. Way. Of course, Reed replied. That's understood. They left as quietly as they had come. Annie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Mom? Yes. He's coming back, Annie said. For real. Rosa sat down heavily. Yes, she said. It seems he is. Outside, a single black sedan pulled up a few hours later. Not a motorcade, not a spectacle, just one car. William stepped out slowly, a cane in one hand. His face was paler than before, the lines around his eyes deeper, but his gaze was steady. He looked at the house, the peeling paint, the narrow porch, the cracked step, and then he walked up. He knocked. Rosa opened the door fully this time. Mrs. Alvarez, William said. May I come in? She studied him, then nodded. Come in. Annie stood a few feet back, watching him with the same careful focus she'd had that night in the snow. You kept your promise, she said. William smiled. So did you. They sat at the table. No one rushed to speak. I don't know how to do this, William said finally. I've spent most of my life talking when I should have been listening. Rosa folded her hands. Then listen, she said. He nodded. I owe Annie my life, he said simply. And I know that debt can't be repaid with money or favors. I'm not here to fix you or save you. I'm here to take responsibility. For what? Annie asked. For a world where a child can scream for help and be ignored, he answered, including by people like me. The room was very quiet. I want to make sure Annie never has to be that cold again, William continued. Not because she saved me, but because she shouldn't have had to. Rosa's jaw tightened. We don't want pity. I'm not offering it, William said. I'm offering choice. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Rosa picked it up, read it slowly. Her eyes widened just slightly. This is, she began. Health coverage, William said. Housing assistance. Education support. Nothing tied to publicity. Nothing conditional. Annie leaned forward. Why? William looked at her. Because when I was trapped, he said, you didn't ask who I was. You just helped. This is me doing the same. Rosa set the paper down. We'll think about it, she said. That's all I ask, William replied. He stood carefully. Thank you for letting me come. We have to most addressed. As he turned to leave, Annie spoke. Mister? Yes? You should be careful in the snow, she said seriously. He smiled. I will, he promised. The door closed behind him. Annie looked up at her mother. He really listened, she said. Rosa nodded slowly. Yes, she said. He did. Outside, the black sedan drove away, leaving behind no noise, no crowd, only the quiet sense that something irreversible had begun. The paper stayed on the table for 3 days. Rosa moved it once, only to wipe beneath it, then placed it back exactly where it had been, as if disturbing its position might invite consequences she wasn't ready to face. Annie noticed. Of course, she noticed everything. Is it bad paper? Annie asked on the second night, crouched on the floor doing homework. No, Rosa replied. It's heavy paper. Annie considered that. Heavy things can fall, she said. Or they can hold things down. E.T. Rosa smiled despite herself. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with quiet speculation. Word traveled the way it always did, sideways. Incomplete. Sharpened by suspicion. People spoke about the car accident behind the mansion, about the black sedan that had stopped in front of Rosa's house, about the idea that a rich white man didn't just walk into a poor black family's life without expecting something in return. Annie heard the whispers at school. Is it true you're rich now? One girl asked. Annie shook her head. No. My mom said that man's probably buying you, another boy said, not unkindly, just curious. Annie frowned. People aren't for buying, the boy shrugged. That's not what my uncle says. That night, Annie asked, Mom, why do people think helping means wanting something back? Rosa paused in her chopping. Because too many people help with strings, she said. And too many people pull them tight afterward. Cummings and Annie nodded slowly. He didn't pull. Not yet, Rosa replied honestly. That's why we're careful. On the 4th day, William returned not to the house, but to the street. He walked slowly along the sidewalk, cane tapping softly, ignoring the looks that followed him like shadows. He didn't stop at the Alvarez house. He passed it once, then again, as if memorizing the ordinary details of the place. From the window, Annie watched him go by. He's walking funny, she observed. Rosa joined her. He's still healing. He came back, Annie said. Even though we didn't say yes. Yes, Rosa agreed. That matters. William felt the eyes on him and didn't turn. He wasn't there to be acknowledged. He was there to remind himself why restraint mattered. Every instinct he had, every tool he'd sharpened over decades urged him to act decisively, to solve, to conclude. This was different. That evening, his assistant called. The board is concerned, she said carefully. They've noticed your absences. They'll live, William replied. And the community outreach team wants to draft a statement. No. Silence stretched on the line. William, she said finally, this isn't how things are usually done. I know, he said. That's the point. At home, Rosa finally picked up the paper and read it again. Slowly, line by line. She didn't look at the numbers. She looked at the conditions. Or rather, the lack of them. No publicity. No deadlines. No obligations. Just options. She folded the paper and placed it in the drawer beneath Annie's school supplies. Mom? Annie asked. Did you hide it? I put it where we can reach it, Rosa said. But where it doesn't watch us. The next week brought a small crisis. Rosa slipped at work, her wrist twisting under her weight. It wasn't broken, but it was swollen and painful, and the doctor recommended rest she couldn't afford. Annie watched her mother struggle to open a jar that night and made a decision. She went to the drawer. She took out the paper. Rosa found her sitting at the table, staring at it. I didn't call him, Annie said quickly. I just looked. Rosa sighed and sat down. I'm not angry. I know, Annie said. I just don't want you to hurt. That was the moment Rosa realized the choice was no longer only hers. The next morning, she called the number on the paper. William answered himself. I was wondering when you'd call, he said. Not smugly, but gently. I'm not saying yes, Rosa said immediately. I'm asking questions. Then we're starting in the right place, William replied. They talked for nearly an hour. About boundaries. About control. about what help looked like when it wasn't charity but respect. At the end of the call, Rosa said, "We'll accept the health coverage, nothing else, for now." William didn't hesitate. "Agreed, Aunt." Annie listened from the hallway, heart pounding. That afternoon, a doctor appointment was scheduled. No press, no fuss. Just a confirmation number and an address. Annie held her mother's hand tightly in the waiting room. "You did good," Rosa whispered. "So did you," Annie replied. Across town, William sat in his office, staring at the city below. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet sense of alignment, like something crooked had been nudged a fraction closer to straight. This wasn't rescue, this was responsibility. And responsibility, he was learning, didn't announce itself with sirens or speeches. It showed up, again and again. The first thing Annie noticed was the quiet. The clinic waiting room wasn't loud the way she expected it to be. No shouting, no arguing, no hurried footsteps echoing down the hall. Just soft voices, the turning of magazine pages, the distant hum of machines she didn't understand. It felt careful, like everyone there was trying not to disturb something fragile. Rosa sat beside her, her injured wrist wrapped neatly in a white brace. She held it close to her body, not complaining, but Annie could tell it hurt by the way her jaw tightened whenever she shifted. "You okay?" Annie whispered. Rosa nodded. "I am now." That answer stayed with Annie. Now, not before, not always, just now. The doctor came in, introduced himself, spoke directly to Rosa, not over her, not around her. He explained things slowly, asked questions, waited for answers. Annie watched closely, absorbing every detail, storing it away like proof that this was real. Afterward, as they walked back outside into the cold but manageable afternoon, Annie squeezed her mother's hand. "You didn't have to pretend you were fine," Annie said. Rosa looked down at her. "I wasn't pretending," she replied. "I was choosing when to ask for help." They walked home in silence, the kind that felt earned. Later that week, William did something he hadn't done in years. He waited. No calls, no follow-ups, no check-ins disguised as concern. He let the agreement sit exactly where Rosa had placed it, partial, intentional, controlled by someone other than him. It was harder than any negotiation he'd ever led. His assistant noticed. "You're letting this one breathe," she said cautiously. "Yes," William replied. "Because if it can't survive without me pushing, it shouldn't exist." She studied him. "You've changed." He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "I'm trying to." At school, Annie's teacher called Rosa in for a meeting. Annie waited outside the classroom, feet swinging, listening to the muffled conversation through the door. "She's bright," the teacher said. "Very bright. But she's distracted." Rosa's voice was calm. "She's had a lot on her mind." "We all have," the teacher replied. "But children shouldn't have to carry adult worries." When Rosa came out, Annie looked up anxiously. "Am I in trouble?" "No," Rosa said. "You're being noticed." That afternoon, Annie found herself thinking about noticing. About who noticed whom, and when. About how being seen could feel dangerous or safe depending on who was doing the looking. A few days later, William returned to the street again. This time, he didn't just walk past. He stopped. Annie was shoveling snow from the sidewalk in front of a neighbor's house, her movements smaller now, more practiced. She froze when she saw him. He raised his free hand slightly. "Hello." "Hi," she said cautiously. "I won't interrupt your work," he said. "I just wanted to say thank you again for letting me help your mom." Annie considered him. "You didn't help me," she said. "No," William agreed. "You helped me." That seemed to satisfy her. "Are you still falling down?" she asked. He smiled. "Less than before." "Good," she said. "Falling is scary." "Yes," he replied quietly. "It is." Rosa watched from the doorway. When Annie finished, she called her inside. William didn't follow. He didn't need to. That night, Rosa and Annie talked longer than usual. "Do you trust him?" Annie asked suddenly. Rosa thought about it. "I trust his actions so far," she said. "Trust is something that grows when it's not rushed." Annie nodded. Like soup, she said. It tastes better if you don't hurry it. Rosa smiled. Exactly like that. I it. Across town, William sat alone with a glass of water. His old pill bottle untouched in the drawer. His leg still ached some nights, but it was a reminder now, not a warning. He opened his laptop and drafted a memo he never sent. It was about responsibility, about systems that worked too late, about how silence often wore the face of order. He closed it without saving. Change, he was learning, didn't start with statements. It started with staying. And somewhere in the city, a 6-year-old girl fell asleep knowing her mother had been cared for not because of luck, not because of pity, but because someone had finally chosen not to look away. Winter loosened its grip slowly, like it didn't trust anyone enough to leave all at once. Snow shrank into dirty piles along the curbs, and the sidewalks revealed the cracks they had hidden for months. Life resumed its pace, but something underneath it had shifted. Annie felt it first. It showed up in small ways. In how her mother laughed more easily, even when money was still tight. In how Rosa no longer winced every time she twisted a lid or lifted a bag of groceries. In how the nights felt less heavy, as if the walls themselves were breathing easier. One afternoon, Annie came home to find Rosa sitting at the table with a notebook open in front of her. "What's that?" Annie asked, dropping her backpack. Rosa hesitated, then smiled. "Plans," she said. "Nothing fancy. Just thinking." Annie leaned over her shoulder. It wasn't numbers or lists the way she expected. It was words, short sentences, ideas written, crossed out, rewritten. "What kind of plans?" Annie asked. Rosa closed the notebook gently. "The kind I stopped making a long time ago." That night, Rosa told her more. "I used to want to take classes," she said quietly, stirring a pot that didn't really need stirring. "Nursing assistant. Something stable. Something that didn't disappear if I got sick for a day." Annie's eyes widened. "Why didn't you?" Rosa didn't answer right away. "Because when you're surviving," she said finally, "you don't plan. You react. With 40 Durace." Annie nodded. She understood reacting. She'd been reacting her whole life. Across town, William sat in a meeting room filled with people who spoke about him as if he weren't there. "We need to address public perception," one man said. "Your recent behavior is unconventional." William folded his hands. "Meaning? You've declined interviews. You've redirected funds without announcement. There are rumors you're becoming erratic." William smiled thinly. "Are the numbers down?" "No. I am. Are operations failing?" "No." "Then I'm not erratic," he said calmly. "I'm just not performing." Silence followed. Later, alone in his office, William allowed himself a moment of honesty. The truth was, the world he'd built worked perfectly as long as you were on the inside of it. The night of the storm had cracked that illusion cleanly in half, and Annie had been standing on the other side. The following Saturday, William returned to the street again. This time, he didn't walk past. Annie was sitting on the front steps, sorting through colored chalk someone had given her at school. She looked up when she saw him. "You're early," she said. "I was hoping you'd say that," William replied. Rosa stepped outside a moment later, wiping her hands on a towel. "Good afternoon," she said politely. "Good afternoon," William answered. "I wanted to ask something. And you can say no." Rosa raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "There's a community center 3 blocks from here," he said. "It's been underfunded for years. I'm considering supporting it, but only if it's something this neighborhood actually wants." Annie frowned. "Why are you asking us?" "Because you live here," William said simply. "And I don't." Rosa crossed her arms, thinking, "People here don't trust things that arrive suddenly," she said. "They've been disappointed too many times." "I understand," William replied. "That's why I'm not offering money yet. Just conversation." Annie looked between them. "You could come to the block meeting," she suggested. William blinked. "The what?" "The block meeting," Annie repeated. "People talk there. They complain a lot." Rosa smiled despite herself. "She's not wrong." William nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "If I'm invited." "You'll be stared at," Rosa warned. "I've been stared at before," he said. Just not by people who could see me clearly. The meeting was held in a church basement, with folding chairs and weak coffee. William sat in the back, unintroduced, unannounced. He listened. People talked about rent, about broken streetlights, about kids walking home in the dark, about how help always came with cameras attached, about how promises didn't survive election cycles. No one asked him to speak. When the meeting ended, an older man turned and looked at him. You gonna say something, or you just here to watch? William stood. I'm here to learn, he said. If you'll let me. Again, the man studied him, then nodded. That's new, he said. Most folks come here to talk over us. Annie watched from the doorway, pride blooming quietly in her chest. Later, walking home, she asked William, Are you tired? Yes, he admitted. Good, she said. That means you're doing it right. Rosa laughed softly. That night, Annie drew something new. Not snow, not storms. A table, people sitting around it. Some standing, some leaning in. No big figure in the center. No spotlight, just faces. She taped it to the wall above her bed. Outside, winter finally surrendered, leaving behind a city marked not just by what it had endured, but by what it was beginning, slowly, to repair. The block meeting changed the way people looked at William, but it changed the way he looked at himself even more. For days afterward, he replayed the voices in his mind, not the loud ones, not the angry ones, but the steady, tired voices of people who had learned to expect disappointment and survive it anyway. They hadn't asked him for anything. That was what unsettled him most. At the mansion, his security chief frowned when William announced he would be walking more often. That neighborhood isn't safe, the man said carefully. William met his eyes. It wasn't safe for Annie either, he replied. She still showed up. The chief said nothing after that. Back on the street, Annie felt the shift in her own quiet way. The neighbors began greeting her more openly now. Some with curiosity, some with warmth, some with guarded interest. She heard William's name spoken less like a rumor and more like a question. Is he really coming back? Is he serious? Or is this just another story that ends early? Annie listened but didn't answer. She had learned something important over the past weeks. Adults needed time to catch up to what children often understood right away. One afternoon, Rosa came home with a folded flyer in her hand. They're restarting evening programs at the community center, she said, setting it on the table. Tutoring, job skills, health workshops. Annie's eyes lit up. Did he do that? Rosa shook her head. No. He helped them do it themselves. That distinction mattered. The first evening Annie attended tutoring. She brought her colored pencils with her. The room smelled like old books and fresh coffee. Folding tables were set up in uneven rows, and volunteers, some young, some gray-haired, sat patiently with children who carried more weight in their eyes than their years suggested. William sat at the back again. Not as a sponsor, just another body in a chair. Annie spotted him immediately. You came, she said. I said I would, he replied. She handed him a drawing without ceremony. It showed a broken streetlight being fixed, a small hand holding a wrench next to a much larger one. William swallowed. May I keep this? Annie shrugged. It's yours if you want it. I do, he said. Later that night, Rosa watched from across the room as William helped an older man fill out paperwork, explaining things slowly, without judgment. She noticed how he listened more than he spoke, how he never checked his phone, how he stayed until the last chair was stacked. When they walked home together, Rosa finally spoke. You're not trying to be a hero, she said. No, William replied. I'm trying to be accountable. She nodded. That's harder. Yes, he agreed. And necessary. 8. That weekend, the whispers changed tone. A local reporter showed up at the edge of the block, camera in hand. William saw him first. No, William said calmly when approached. Not today. Not ever. If this is the angle you're thinking of, the reporter scoffed. People want a story. William glanced at Annie, who was drawing hopscotch squares on the sidewalk with chalk. Then tell them a boring one, he said. Tell them nothing happened fast. That no one was rescued. That people just stayed. The reporter left. Annie looked up. Why didn't you want the story? William thought for a moment. Because some stories stop being true once they're told too loudly. That night, alone in his mansion, William opened the drawer with the pill bottle. He held it for a long time, then closed the drawer without taking anything. The pain was still there, the weakness, the reminders of his limits. But so was something else now. Connection. Across town, Annie fell asleep at her desk, head resting on a drawing she hadn't finished yet. Rosa lifted her gently and carried her to bed. You did good today, Rosa whispered. Annie murmured sleepily. He's still here. Yes, Rosa said. He is. And that, more than the cars or the money or the promises, was what began to change the shape of the future. Spring arrived without ceremony. There were no announcements, no clear moment when winter officially ended. It simply loosened its hold one morning, and Annie noticed she no longer needed gloves to hold her chalk. The air felt lighter. The street smelled different. Even the neighborhood seemed to breathe with less effort. Change, Annie had learned, didn't always make noise. At the community center, the evening programs were growing. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. More chairs were filled each week. More lights stayed on later. Someone donated an old coffee machine. Someone else brought folding tables from a closed church hall. People stopped waiting for permission and started doing what needed to be done. William was there often. Not always visible, not always needed, but present. He learned names. He learned which jokes landed and which didn't. He learned that showing up consistently mattered more than showing up impressively. And he learned, uncomfortably, how many systems had failed quietly while he'd been busy succeeding loudly. One night, an argument broke out during a meeting. A man stood up, voice sharp. You don't belong here, he said, pointing directly at William. You think you can just walk into our problems and make them yours? The room went silent. William didn't respond right away. He felt the old instinct rise, the urge to control, to defend, to reframe. Instead, he stayed still. You're right, he said finally. I don't belong to your problems. They belong to you. I'm only here because I live in the same city, and pretended for a long time that your problems weren't connected to mine. The man crossed his arms. And now? Now, William said. I'm listening. If you want me gone, say it. If you want me to stay, tell me how without making me the center of anything. The man stared at him, searching for something false to grab onto. Finally, he sat down. The meeting continued. Annie watched the exchange from the corner, her feet swinging from a chair too tall for her. She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the tone. She understood humility when she heard it. On the walk home, she asked, Were you scared? William considered the question. Yes, he said, but not of being yelled at. Then what? Of being right, he answered. Of realizing how long I'd been wrong. Annie nodded. Being wrong hurts, she said, but falling hurts more. That night, Rosa received an email. It was from a local college. Adult education program. Evening classes. Financial aid available. Flexible schedules. She read it 3 times. Annie watched her mother's face carefully. Is it good news? Rosa swallowed. It's a door, she said. One I thought was closed. Doors can open, Annie said matter-of-factly. Yes, Rosa agreed softly. They can. The captoed. Across town, William sat alone in his study. The drawing Annie had given him framed on his desk. The broken streetlight was now fixed in pencil, the light spilling outward, uneven but bright. He thought about his own childhood, long buried under years of achievement, about the way his father had taught him to endure silently, about how vulnerability had always been framed as inefficiency. He understood now how wrong that lesson had been. The next morning, William collapsed, not dramatically, not in public. He stood from his chair too quickly, the familiar weakness rushing through his legs, sharper than it had been in weeks. He grabbed the desk, breath shallow, heart racing. The room tilted. This time, there was no snow, no storm, no child nearby. There There was only the truth he had been avoiding. He needed help. He sat down slowly and picked up the phone. "Dr. Myers," he said when the line connected. "I think I've been underestimating my condition." 80. There was a pause. Then concern. Then questions. William answered them all. That afternoon, Rosa noticed the black sedan parked farther down the street than usual. It stayed there for a long time. Annie noticed too. "Is he sick?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Rosa said honestly. They found out that evening. William didn't come to the community center. Instead, a message arrived. Brief, direct, medical setback. Rest required. Will return when cleared. Annie stared at the phone after Rosa read it aloud. "He didn't say goodbye," Annie said. "No," Rosa replied. "He said he'd come back." That night, Annie drew again. This time, it was a man sitting down on a bench, head bowed. Nearby, a small figure waited, not touching, not pulling, just present. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her backpack. William spent the night in a hospital room that was far too quiet. Machines beeped softly, indifferent to status or net worth. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, confronting the simple truth that frightened him more than the storm ever had. He could not fix everything by himself, and for the first time in his life, he didn't want to. He closed his eyes, breathing carefully, and thought of Annie's voice, calm and certain. "You're not alone." The hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant and something metallic, a smell William had always associated with weakness. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of the heart monitor beside him. Each beep was precise, impartial. It didn't care who he was or what he owned. For the first time in decades, his schedule had been taken out of his hands. "You're lucky, Doctor," Myers said later that morning, standing at the foot of the bed with a tablet tucked under his arm. "Another few minutes in that condition, and you could have collapsed somewhere less forgiving." William closed his eyes briefly. Snow flashed through his mind. Pain. A small voice calling him back. "I know," he said quietly. Dr. Myers studied him. "You've been compensating for a long time. Medications, overwork, ignoring symptoms. Your body finally called the meeting you kept canceling. It's graded." William almost smiled. "That sounds like me." "You'll need rest," the doctor continued. "Real rest. Not the kind you schedule between phone calls." "And if I don't?" William asked. Dr. Myers didn't hesitate. "Then next time, there may not be a child in a snowstorm." That landed hard. William nodded. "I'll listen." Across town, Annie felt the absence like a missing note in a song. The community center was still full. The program still ran. People still laughed and argued and showed up, but she noticed the empty chair at the back of the room. "He always sits there," she whispered to Rosa one evening. "Yes," Rosa said. "He does." Annie pulled the folded drawing from her backpack and stared at it. She had planned to give it to him. Now she didn't know when she would. "Mom," she asked softly, "do grown-ups get scared when they're sick?" Rosa considered the question carefully. "Sometimes more than children," she said, "because they're used to pretending they're not." Annie nodded. "I think he pretends less now." "Yes," Rosa agreed. "I think he does too." At the hospital, William turned off his phone more often than he turned it on. He ignored emails, deferred meetings, let people wait. Instead, he thought about the man at the block meeting who had challenged him, about Rosa's steady refusal to be rushed or dazzled, about Annie's blunt honesty, the way she treated promises as things that existed or didn't, no excuses in between. He realized something uncomfortable. His power had always allowed him to leave, to exit rooms, to end conversations, to avoid accountability, simply by being unreachable. Annie had never had that option. 2 days later, Rosa received a handwritten note in the mail. Not typed, not official, just careful, slightly uneven handwriting. "Mrs. Alvarez, I wanted Annie to know I'm resting, not leaving. Please tell her I'll come back when I'm stronger. The right way this time. Thank you for teaching me patience. William." Rosa read it twice, then handed it to Annie. Annie traced the letters with her finger. "He writes like he's thinking," she said. Yes, Rosa replied. That's usually how truth sounds. Annie folded the note carefully and placed it under her pillow that night. At school, Annie was quieter than usual. Her teacher noticed. Everything okay? She asked gently. Annie nodded. Someone I know is learning how to rest. It's so. The teacher smiled, unsure what to make of that. Back at the hospital, William stood for the first time without assistance. His legs trembled, but he stayed upright. Dr. Myers watched closely. Slow progress, the doctor said, but real. I don't need fast, William replied. I need honest. That evening, William asked for a visitor. His assistant arrived, surprised to find him dressed in regular clothes instead of a hospital gown. I want you to change a few things, William said. Not publicly, internally. She listened as he spoke about succession planning, about distributing authority, about building systems that didn't collapse when one man stepped back. You're planning to step back, she said carefully. I'm planning to stay alive, William replied. There's a difference. She nodded slowly. I'll make it happen. When she left, William sat alone by the window, watching the city lights flicker on. Somewhere down there, Annie was probably finishing her homework. Rosa was likely cleaning up dinner. Tired but steady, the world kept turning without him directing it, and for the first time, that felt like relief. 3 days later, Annie returned to the community center and found something new taped to the bulletin board. A simple note. Back soon. Thank you for holding the place. She smiled. He's coming back, she said to Rosa. Yes, Rosa replied. But not the same way. It's Cell Jobser. My goated. Annie thought about that as she colored at the table. She added a small detail to her drawing. The waiting figure now had both feet planted firmly on the ground. That night, William slept deeply, without dreams of falling. He was learning, slowly and painfully, that strength wasn't proven by standing alone. It was proven by knowing when to sit down and trusting that someone would still be there when you stood again. William returned on a Tuesday, not with an announcement, not with a driver opening doors for him, but on foot, cane in hand, moving carefully and deliberately, as if each step mattered more now, because he knew it could be taken away. The neighborhood noticed anyway. It always did. Annie was the first to see him. She was sitting on the curb with a piece of chalk, halfway through drawing a crooked sun when his shadow fell across the pavement. She looked up slowly, squinting against the light. You're back, she said. I am, William replied. Just like I said. She stood, brushing chalk dust from her knees, and studied him with the seriousness of someone inspecting a promise. You're walking slower, she observed. Yes, he said, and listening faster. That earned a small smile. Rosa came to the door moments later. She stopped when she saw him, her expression cautious but not closed. You should be resting, she said. I am, William answered. This is part of it. To me from then. They walked together toward the community center, not side by side but close enough that the distance felt intentional, rather than hesitant. William didn't speak much. He was learning that returning didn't mean reclaiming space. It meant re-entering it carefully. Inside, the center buzzed with quiet activity. Chairs scraped, children laughed. Someone spilled coffee and apologized too loudly. Life, in all its imperfect persistence, carried on. A few people noticed William immediately. A few nodded. A few watched without comment. No one clapped. No one asked him to speak. He took his old seat in the back. Annie slid into the chair next to him without asking. You're not sick anymore? She asked. No, he said. But I'm not pretending either. She seemed to approve of that. During the meeting, a woman stood up and spoke about the streetlights again. This time, she brought a list. Names, addresses, places where darkness lingered longer than it should. William listened, hands folded, jaw tight. Afterward, when the room began to empty, he approached her. I know someone who can help with permits, he said. If you want, quietly. The woman studied him. You don't get to decide, she said. I know, William replied. You do? She nodded once. Then, help us decide. That was enough. Later that night, William sat alone on a bench outside the center, breathing in the cool air. Annie joined him, swinging her legs. You didn't fix anything today, she said matter-of-factly. No, he agreed. But you stayed. Yes, That counts, she said. He smiled, feeling the truth of it settle somewhere deep and unfamiliar. At home, Rosa cooked dinner while Annie did homework at the table. The radio played softly in the background. The house felt fuller somehow, though nothing tangible had changed. "Mom," Annie asked suddenly, "do you think people can be two things at once?" Rosa glanced over. "What do you mean?" "Like," Annie said, choosing her words carefully, "being rich and being scared, being strong and being tired." Rosa thought for a moment. "I think most people are many things at once," she said. "They just don't always admit it." Annie nodded. "He admits it now." "Yes," Rosa said softly, "he does." Across town, William stood in his study, looking at the drawing Annie had given him weeks ago. The broken streetlight had been fixed in pencil. Tonight, he noticed something new he hadn't before. A small figure standing beneath it, hands in pockets, head tilted upward, as if waiting to see whether the light would hold. He understood that feeling now. The next morning, William canceled a meeting he would have once considered untouchable. Instead, he went to physical therapy. He followed instructions. He stopped when told to stop. Progress was slow, humbling, necessary. In the afternoon, he received an email from his board, carefully worded, concerned, questioning. He closed it without replying. That evening, Annie taped a new drawing to her wall. It showed a road splitting into two paths. On one, a man walked alone, head down. On the other, he walked slower, surrounded by smaller figures, all facing forward. She didn't label it. She didn't need to. The neighborhood changed in small increments. A light fixed here. A program added there. Nothing miraculous. Nothing headline-worthy. But Annie noticed how people lingered a little longer after meetings now. How voices sounded less tired. How Rosa started talking seriously about classes again. Not as a dream, but as a plan. One night, as William prepared to leave the center, an older man stopped him. "You still got a lot to answer for," the man said. "I know," William replied. "But you're answering," the man continued. "That's new." William nodded. "I'm not done." "Good," the man said. "Neither are we." He betted 9. On the walk home, Annie held her mother's hand tighter than usual. "Things don't feel finished," she said. "No," Rosa agreed. "They're just finally moving." That night, William slept with the window slightly open, city sounds drifting in. He dreamed not of falling, not of snow, but of walking, slowly. Surrounded by voices he could hear clearly for the first time. He woke with the ache still in his leg, the limit still present, but also with something steadier than strength. Commitment. The first real test came without warning. It arrived not as a crisis, but as an opportunity, one that carried the familiar shine of good intentions and the quieter weight of consequences. A regional foundation reached out to the community center with an offer. A substantial grant, enough to fund programs for years. There would be conditions, of course. A rebranding, a launch event, media coverage. The email was printed and passed from hand to hand at the next meeting. "This could change everything," someone said. "It could ruin it," someone else replied. William sat in his usual chair, silent. He felt the old reflex tighten in his chest, the urge to evaluate, to advise, to steer. He didn't speak. Rosa watched him carefully. The room buzzed with debate. People spoke about rent assistance, about keeping the lights on, about how tired they were of scraping by. Others spoke about dignity, about ownership, about how many times help had arrived wearing a smile and left with the keys. Annie sat on the floor with her crayons, listening. Finally, the facilitator turned to William. "You've dealt with foundations," she said. "What do you think?" William felt every eye settle on him. "I think," he said slowly, "that if I answer first, I'll be answering instead of you." Silence followed. "I can explain the fine print if you want," he added, "but the decision shouldn't be mine." That mattered more than anything he could have said. They voted to take a week. That night, Annie asked questions. "Why didn't you tell them what to do?" she asked as Rosa washed dishes. "Because telling people what to do isn't the same as helping," Rosa replied. Annie looked thoughtful. It's like grabbing someone's pencil instead of showing them how to draw. Rosa smiled. Exactly. It's C. Across town, William sat at his desk, staring at the city map pinned to the wall. He saw patterns, now gaps, overlaps, places where resources clustered and places they avoided. He saw how easy it would be to intervene loudly. He didn't. Instead, he made calls. Quiet ones. To people who knew zoning laws. To people who knew how grants really worked. To people who had seen communities lose control, one smiling contract at a time. He took notes. At school the next day, Annie got into trouble. Not serious trouble, but enough to sting. A boy had made a joke about her mother's job, about how some people needed rich friends to survive. Annie had stood up, pushed her chair back too hard, and told him he was wrong. "You don't get to say that," she had said. "You weren't there." The teacher sent her to the hallway. When Rosa came in after work, Annie told her everything, bracing herself. Rosa listened without interruption. "You shouldn't have pushed the chair," she said calmly. "I know," Annie replied, eyes down. "But you were right to speak," Rosa continued. "Just remember how you say something decides whether people hear it." Annie nodded slowly. "I was mad." "Yes," Rosa said. "Anger isn't bad. It just needs direction." That evening, William stopped by the house with a small envelope. No security, no driver waiting with the engine running. "I'm not here about the grant," he said immediately. "This is personal." Rosa accepted the envelope cautiously. Inside was a scholarship application. Not filled out. Not pre-approved. Just information. "Evening program," William said. "For nursing assistants. The one you mentioned." Rosa's breath caught. "I didn't sign anything," he added. "I just made sure it exists." She held the paper like it might vanish. "Thank you," she said quietly. Annie watched, understanding more than either adult realized. The week passed. At the next meeting, the decision was made. They declined the grant, not because they didn't need the money, but because the cost was too high. William didn't smile. He didn't congratulate anyone. He simply nodded, a weight lifting he hadn't realized he was carrying. That night, Annie drew again. This time, it was a table with a paper on it. Everyone's hands were visible. No one held the pen alone. She showed it to William when he walked her home from the center. "You didn't try to change their minds," she said. "No," he replied. "I tried to change my habits." She seemed pleased with that. Later, alone, William reflected on how easily the old version of himself would have seen the decision as inefficient, emotional, short-sighted. How quickly he would have overridden it in the name of outcomes. He was beginning to understand something deeper. Justice wasn't loud, it wasn't fast, and it rarely looked impressive from the outside. It looked like restraint, like listening, like letting people keep what was theirs even when you could take control more easily. On Sunday evening, Rosa sat at the table filling out the application. Annie colored beside her. "Are you scared?" Annie asked. "Yes," Rosa admitted. "Good," Annie said gently. "That means it matters." Rosa reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. Outside, the city hummed. Somewhere, deals were being made, power shifting hands the way it always had. But in this small house, something else was happening. People were choosing not to trade dignity for relief. And that choice, quiet, uncelebrated, was beginning to feel like the strongest thing any of them had ever done. The first phone call came at dawn. William was awake already. Sitting at the kitchen table with his cane leaned against the chair, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands, he had slept poorly. Not from pain, but from the unfamiliar tension of waiting. When the phone vibrated, he didn't flinch. He had been expecting resistance. He just hadn't known from where. "William," the voice said, smooth and practiced. "We need to talk." It was a board member, one of the old guard, a man who had benefited from William's decisiveness for years and mistook restraint for weakness. "I've heard you've been distracted," the man continued. "Skipping meetings, turning down visibility, letting community groups make decisions without guidance." William closed his eyes for a moment. "They didn't ask for guidance," he said calmly. "They asked for space. That's not how influence works." "Maybe that's the problem," William replied. The line went quiet. Then, colder. You're risking more than your reputation. So are they, William said. Every day. He ended the call before the argument could become familiar. Across town, Annie was late for school. Not because she overslept, but because she insisted on walking Rosa all the way to the bus stop first, holding her hand like she used to when she was smaller. You don't have to, Rosa said gently. I know, Annie replied. I want to. Rosa smiled, though worry creased her face. The application sat folded carefully in her bag. She hadn't told anyone at work yet. Hope, she had learned, was safest when carried quietly. At school, Annie noticed things more sharply lately. How teachers paused before calling on her. How some kids watched her when William dropped her off on meeting nights. How kindness and suspicion sometimes wore the same face. At recess, the same boy from before approached her again. My dad says that old rich guy is just using you, he said. Annie didn't raise her voice this time. Maybe, she said. But he's also listening. That's new for people like him. The boy frowned, unsure how to respond to something that didn't sound rehearsed. That afternoon, the snow began again. Not a storm, not yet, but enough to slow traffic, enough to bring back memories no one wanted. William felt it in his leg before he saw it on the streets. The ache sharpened, not from cold, but from remembering how easily everything could tip. He went to the community center anyway. Inside, tension hung thicker than the winter air. A reporter had shown up unannounced. Questions were asked. Cameras were raised. Someone mentioned William's name too loudly. This is why we said no, someone muttered. William stepped forward before anyone could stop him. No interviews, he said firmly. Not today. Not like this, the reporter scoffed. You don't speak for them. No, William said. But I can speak for myself. Okay. He turned to the room. I'm leaving, he said. Now. I don't want my presence to turn your work into a headline. There were protests, quiet ones, reluctant nods. Annie watched him go, her chest tight. Outside, William paused, snow gathering on his coat. He wondered, briefly, whether walking away now would undo everything, whether absence would look like abandonment. Then he remembered something Annie had said weeks ago. Staying didn't always mean standing in the middle. That night, Rosa came home exhausted. She dropped her bag, sank into a chair, and stared at the wall. I almost didn't go, she admitted to Annie. I almost didn't apply. Annie sat beside her. But you did. Yes, Rosa said. Because you watched me. They laughed softly, the sound tired but real. The next day, the backlash arrived. Emails, op-eds, quiet warnings disguised as concern. William read them all. He responded to none. Instead, he visited a physical therapist. He attended a community cleanup without being asked. He listened to a man talk about losing his job for 40 minutes without interrupting once. Each act felt small. Together, they felt like resistance. At the end of the week, Rosa received a letter. She read it twice before her hands began to shake. Accepted. Not full coverage. Not easy. But enough to begin. Annie jumped when she heard the news, wrapping her arms around her mother's waist. You're going to help people, she said proudly. Rosa held her tightly. So are you. That evening, Annie drew again. This time, it wasn't a scene. It was a word. Listening. She colored it carefully and taped it above her bed. Across town, William stood in his study as snow fell quietly outside. He thought about the board, about the calls that would come, about how much easier it would be to retreat fully now. Then he thought about Annie standing her ground without raising her voice, about Rosa choosing fear over stagnation, about a community that had said no when yes would have been simpler. He sat down heavily, leg aching, heart steady. For the first time in decades, he wasn't measuring progress by speed or scale. He was measuring it by alignment. And for once, his life felt aligned. The winter didn't leave all at once. It loosened its grip in pieces, thawing sidewalks by day, freezing them again by night, leaving behind a city that looked clean from a distance but dangerous up close. William learned quickly that recovery worked the same way. Some mornings, his leg felt almost reliable. Other days, it betrayed him without warning. A sharp reminder that strength once assumed had become conditional. He adjusted without complaint. Kane by the door. Shoes chosen for balance, not appearance. Pride folded away quietly, like a coat no longer suitable for the weather. Annie noticed everything. "You're leaning more today," she said one afternoon as they walked toward the corner store. "Yes," William admitted. "Did you sleep?" "Not well." She nodded, satisfied with the honesty. "You should rest more." He smiled. "You sound like my doctor." "I'm better," she said. "I pay attention." At school, Annie's world was shifting too. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they had changed tone. Some kids asked questions now. Real ones. About the meetings. About why grown-ups argued over lights and sidewalks and programs instead of just fixing them. Annie didn't pretend to understand everything. "I just know when something feels wrong," she told her teacher during a writing exercise. "And when people don't listen, wrong things stay wrong longer." Her teacher underlined the sentence twice. Rosa's days became fuller, heavier, brighter. She attended orientation for the evening program, sitting among strangers who carried their own versions of exhaustion. She learned bus schedules by heart, learned which days would stretch too thin and which could be survived with leftovers and patience. At night, she studied at the table while Annie colored nearby, the quiet between them comfortable. "I'm scared I'll mess this up," Rosa admitted once, voice low. "You always say that," Annie replied. "And you always keep going." Rosa smiled, eyes damp. "You don't let me quit." "No," Annie said. "I just remind you who you are." Meanwhile, the pressure on William increased. A second board member called. Then a third. Invitations dried up. Influence, he learned, had an expiration date when it stopped performing as expected. One afternoon, he received a formal letter requesting his resignation from a committee he had chaired for over a decade. No explanation, just gratitude and finality. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. That evening, he didn't go to the community center. He walked instead slowly, deliberately past streets he had helped rename, buildings he had helped fund, people who had never known his name. For the first time, the absence of recognition didn't sting. It clarified. At home, he sat alone, lights low, snowmelt dripping steadily from the roof outside. He thought of the night Annie had found him buried and shaking, of how little his status had mattered then. The body didn't care who you were, neither did the cold. The next day, a storm hit again. Smaller than the first, but sharp enough to close schools and slow buses. Annie stayed home, watching flakes gather against the window. "Do you think bad things come back to test us?" she asked Rosa. "I think they come back to see if we've learned anything," Rosa replied. That afternoon, William knocked on their door earlier than usual. He looked tired. Not weak, just worn thin in a way that comes from choosing the harder path repeatedly. "I didn't want to be alone today," he said plainly. Rosa stepped aside. "Then, you're in the right place." They sat together in the living room, while Annie built a lopsided tower of books on the floor. "I lost something," William said after a while. Rosa waited. "My seat," he continued. "My voice, in some rooms." "Well, and how does that feel?" she asked. "Like relief," he said, surprising himself. Annie looked up. "Maybe now you can hear better." He laughed softly. "You might be right." The storm passed by morning. On the walk to school, Annie slipped on a patch of ice. William caught her just in time, his grip steady despite the strain. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said, heart racing. Then, after a pause, "You didn't fall." "No," he said quietly. "I adjusted." She thought about that all day. That evening, the community center hosted a small gathering. No press, no announcements. Just soup, folding chairs, conversation. William arrived late and took a seat near the wall. An older woman stood and spoke about a neighbor who had lost heat during the storm. People volunteered without prompting. Lists formed organically. Help moved without instruction. William watched, chest tight. This was what he had once believed leadership looked like. He had been wrong. Afterward, Annie handed him a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing of a man walking with a cane beside a small figure. Above them, uneven letters spelled out, "Still here." William swallowed hard. "Yes," he said. "I am." That night, As snow softened the city once more, William lay awake thinking not of what he had lost, but of what he had stopped chasing. Control, approval, the illusion of indispensability. In their place grew something quieter and stronger. Belonging. Spring announced itself quietly, not with warmth, not with blossoms, but with mud. With sidewalks softening, with snow retreating into gray piles that lingered stubbornly in corners, refusing to disappear all at once. The city looked tired of winter, the way people did after surviving something difficult without quite knowing how. William felt it in his body first. The stiffness eased in the mornings. The pain no longer flared without warning. It didn't vanish, but it negotiated. That felt like progress. Annie noticed too. "You're standing straighter," she said one afternoon as they waited for the light to change. "I'm trusting my leg again," he replied. She shook her head. "No, you're trusting yourself." That stopped him. At school, Annie had been asked to speak, not formally, not in front of an audience, but during a small assembly about kindness and community. The counselor had seen her writing, her drawings, the way other children listened when she spoke without trying to impress. Annie didn't want to at first. "What if I say it wrong?" she asked Rosa the night before. "You might," Rosa said gently, "and that's okay. But grown-ups don't always listen," Annie said. Rosa knelt in front of her. "Some do. And the ones who don't need to hear it the most." I too nined. The next day, Annie stood at the front of the room, feet planted, hands shaking just a little. She didn't tell the story the way adults would have. She didn't explain systems or policies or fairness in neat phrases. She said, "Sometimes people think helping means fixing things fast. But when things are broken, fast fixing can break more. Listening takes longer, but it hurts less." The room stayed quiet. Even the teachers. Afterward, a girl she barely knew hugged her without asking. At the community center, change came slowly but visibly. Attendance grew. Not dramatically, not enough to draw attention, but enough that chairs had to be added. Programs adjusted based on feedback instead of funding pressure. Decisions were made by consensus, messy and imperfect and real. William continued to stay in the background. Some nights, that was harder than others, especially when someone struggled with a problem he knew exactly how to solve with a phone call, especially when impatience whispered that efficiency was still a virtue. But he remembered the cost of shortcuts. He remembered the snow. One evening, a man arrived angry. Not loud, angry, tired angry, the kind that trembled under the surface. He had been denied housing assistance again. He wanted names. He wanted reasons. He wanted someone to blame. The room tensed. William didn't move. Rosa spoke first. She didn't defend the system. She didn't promise results. She listened for 20 minutes. When the man finished, his shoulders sagged. "I just don't want to feel invisible," he said. Rosa nodded. "I know that feeling." Afterward, Annie whispered to William, "You didn't say anything." "I didn't need to," he replied. That night, William received an unexpected call. A journalist, not aggressive, curious. "I've been following what you haven't been doing," she said. "That's interesting to me." He considered. "I'm not the story," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you're part of it." He declined politely. For the first time, turning down visibility felt like integrity instead of loss. At home, Rosa struggled. The program was harder than she had imagined. Long nights, doubt creeping in during quiet moments, the fear of failing not just herself, but the possibility she represented to Annie. One night, she cried at the table, books spread open, untouched. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Annie wrapped her arms around her. "You already are." Rosa laughed weakly. "That doesn't mean I'll finish." "No," Annie said, "but it means you're brave enough to try." The next morning, Rosa went back to class. William watched Annie that afternoon as she helped a younger child with homework at the center, her voice patient, her explanations careful. He realized something then that tightened his chest. She wasn't learning leadership. She was practicing it. Spring deepened. The last of the snow disappeared. Trees budded. Windows opened. The city exhaled. William walked without his cane for the first time one afternoon, just around the block. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't need applause. When he returned, Annie noticed anyway. "You didn't bring it," she said. No, he replied. But I didn't throw it away either. She nodded approvingly. That's smart. At the end of the month, the community center held a modest fundraiser. Local. Homemade food. No speeches longer than necessary. William donated anonymously. It felt right. As the evening wound down, Annie handed him another drawing. This one showed a cracked road with green lines pushing through the breaks. Small figures stood around it, not repairing the cracks, but letting something grow. What is it? William asked. Change, she said simply. The kind that doesn't look neat. He studied it for a long time. Yes, he said softly. That's exactly it. That night, William slept deeply. No dreams of falling, no echoes of snow, just a sense of ground beneath him, uneven, imperfect, real. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It wasn't thick. It wasn't dramatic. Just a standard envelope with Rosa's name typed neatly on the front. The return address of the program printed in small, official letters. She stared at it for a long time before opening it, as if the paper itself could sense her hesitation. Annie watched from the doorway. You're holding your breath, she said. Rosa laughed nervously and exhaled. I didn't even notice. As a whale. She opened the envelope slowly. Read once, then again. Her eyes moving faster the second time. Her hand went to her mouth. What? Annie asked, stepping closer. Rosa knelt and pulled her into a hug so tight Annie squeaked. I passed, she whispered. Not just passed. They want me to continue into the next level. Annie beamed. I told you. Rosa shook her head, tears finally falling. You believed before I did. That night, they celebrated with what they had. Soup warmed twice, bread toasted until almost burned, laughter that felt earned instead of borrowed. When William stopped by later, Rosa told him quietly, not as an announcement but as a confession. He nodded once. You did the work. We all did, she replied, glancing at Annie. William smiled at that. He had learned when to accept gratitude and when to step aside from it. The following weeks carried a strange mix of calm and anticipation. Something was coming. They could all feel it. The community center had grown steadier, but with that steadiness came attention, not the shallow kind this time, not the kind that demanded faces and slogans, but the cautious interest of institutions that sensed something working without understanding why. A city council member attended one meeting and said very little. A nonprofit director asked questions instead of offering solutions. People listened more than they spoke. That unsettled some. William noticed the shift immediately. Power didn't like to be redefined quietly. It preferred conflict or praise. This slow redistribution of voice was harder to counter because it didn't announce itself. One afternoon, as William walked home, a man stopped him outside a cafe. You're wasting influence, the man said flatly. William recognized him. Old circles. Old assumptions. No, William replied calmly. I'm returning it. The man scoffed. To who? To the people who live with the consequences, William said, not the ones who visit them. That night, William dreamed again. This time, not of falling. He dreamed of standing at a door, holding it open while others passed through. No one thanked him. No one noticed when he stepped away. He woke feeling oddly at peace. At school, Annie faced her own turning point. The counselor called Rosa in for a meeting not because of trouble, but because of potential. They spoke about programs, about accelerated tracks, about opportunities. Isa mocked. Rosa listened carefully. Will she still be with kids like her? Rosa asked. The counselor hesitated. Not exactly. Rosa nodded slowly. Then we need to think. That evening, Rosa explained everything to Annie. You don't have to decide now, she said, and you don't have to want what they think is best. Annie considered this seriously. I like learning, she said, but I don't want to leave everyone behind. Rosa touched her cheek. You don't have to. You just have to keep your feet on the ground you care about. Annie smiled. I know where that is. At the community center, a meeting ran long. There was disagreement. Real disagreement. Voices rose. Someone accused someone else of not understanding how things really work. William watched, hands folded, heart steady. This was growth too. When the argument finally burned itself out, Annie spoke up from the back. What if both things are true? She said. What if we need help and also need to be careful about who helps us? The room quieted. An older man nodded slowly. That's what we've been trying to say. Annie sat back down, cheeks warm. Later, Rosa whispered. You were very brave. Annie shrugged. I wasn't trying to be. That was how it always was. Spring tipped toward early summer. Trees filled out. Sidewalks dried. Windows stayed open late into the evening. William walked farther now. Some days without pain. Some days with it. He didn't measure progress by comfort anymore, but by trust. Trust in his body. Trust in his choices. Trust in the fact that not everything had to be controlled to be protected. One afternoon, he stood outside the old mansion. The gates were still there. The stone just as imposing, but the place felt hollow now, like a chapter already finished. He didn't go in. Instead, he turned back toward the smaller streets, the uneven sidewalks, the places where people said his name without titles. At home, Annie worked on a final drawing. She took her time with this one, erased, redrew, colored carefully. When she finished, she handed it to Rosa and William together. It showed 3 figures standing beneath a sky that was neither stormy nor clear, just open. Behind them, faint outlines of others, neighbors, strangers, shapes still forming. Above it, she had written, We didn't fix everything. Below that, in smaller letters, But we stayed. William felt something tighten in his throat. Yes, he said quietly. That's the truth. That night, Rosa tucked Annie into bed and lingered longer than usual. Things are changing, Rosa said softly. Yes, Annie replied. Are you scared? Annie thought for a moment. A little. But not the bad kind. Rosa kissed her forehead. That's called growing. Across town, William stood at his window, looking out at a city no longer blurred by snow or distance. He knew something was coming next. Not a storm, a decision. And for the first time, he felt ready to meet it without armor. The decision arrived without ceremony. No knock on the door. No urgent call. Just a quiet understanding that settled into the house one evening as the sun dipped low and painted the walls gold. Annie sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through her drawings, while Rosa folded laundry at the table. William stood near the window, watching the street fill with the slow rhythm of people returning home. I think, Annie said suddenly, that this is what staying feels like. Rosa looked up. What do you mean? Not being loud, Annie replied. Not running away. Just choosing the same place again. William turned from the window. The words landed deeper than she knew. That week, the city council vote passed quietly. A pilot program, small, locally guided, protected from outside branding, was approved for the neighborhood. No speeches, no press releases, just a line item most people would never read. The community center celebrated with coffee and donated pastries. No one thanked William. He wouldn't have accepted it anyway. Rosa's life found a new rhythm. Classes, work, evenings filled with tired satisfaction instead of quiet fear. She no longer studied to escape, but to build. That difference mattered. Annie noticed how her mother stood taller now, how she laughed more easily, how the future had shifted from something to survive into something to shape. One afternoon, Annie came home from school holding a flyer. They want me to apply, she said. Rosa read it carefully. You don't have to. I know, Annie replied. But I want to. Why? Rosa asked. Annie thought for a moment. Because I want to learn more. And then I want to come back. Rosa smiled, eyes shining. That sounds like you. William heard the conversation from the doorway and felt a familiar ache, not of loss, but of distance. He knew Annie would outgrow him one day. That was how time worked. The important thing was that she would know where she came from. The mansion was sold by summer. William didn't attend the closing. He didn't walk through the rooms one last time. He had already said goodbye on the night he chose not to go back inside. He moved into a smaller place near the park. One floor, wide windows, a bench nearby where he could sit and watch the city without feeling like he owned it. People greeted him there. Not with deference, with recognition. That felt better. On the anniversary of the storm, snow did not fall. Instead, the day arrived clear and cold. the sky wide and honest. The community center hosted a gathering, not a commemoration, not a fundraiser, just a meal. Soup again. Bread again, familiar and grounding. Someone asked William if he wanted to say a few words. He shook his head. Annie tugged at his sleeve. "You don't have to," she whispered. "But you can." William considered that. Then he stood. "I won't be long," he said. The room stilled. "I spent most of my life believing that being useful meant being in charge," he continued. "I thought safety came from control. That order came from authority." He paused, choosing honesty over polish. "I was wrong." A murmur moved through the room. "I learned very late that real stability comes from people being seen. From voices not being rushed. From communities deciding for themselves what they need." He glanced at Annie, then at Rosa. "I didn't save anyone," he said. "I was saved by kindness I didn't earn. By courage that didn't look like power. By people who stayed when leaving would have been easier." Silence followed. Not awkward. Full. William sat down. Annie exhaled like she'd been holding her breath. That night, Annie finished her last drawing for the series. She brought it to William carefully, like a fragile thing. It showed a storm cloud drifting away. Not gone, just moving. Below it, a neighborhood. Lights on. Doors open. No single figure at the center. "What's this one called?" William asked. Annie shrugged. "It doesn't need a name." He understood. Later, after Rosa had gone to bed and the house settled into quiet, William sat alone with the drawing. He thought about the man he had been the night of the storm, buried, shaking, convinced his life was something that could be measured in achievements. He thought about the girl who had run toward danger without asking what it would cost her. About a mother who opened her door when fear would have been justified. About a city that had learned, slowly, to listen to itself. In the morning, Annie left early for school. She paused at the door. "You'll still be here when I get back, right?" "Yes," William said without hesitation. She smiled and ran off. William stood by the window long after she disappeared down the street. The world outside was imperfect, unequal, still carrying storms it hadn't yet faced. But inside him, something had settled. Not certainty, commitment. He turned away from the window and picked up his coat. Ready to walk into the day, not as a savior, not as a ruler, but as a man who had learned, at last, that justice often arrives quietly, and when it does, it sounds a lot like staying. The lesson of this story is that true justice and real humanity do not come from power, wealth, or control, but from presence, humility, and the courage to listen. Help that is rushed or imposed can deepen wounds, while help that is patient and respectful can restore dignity. The story reminds us that people are not saved by heroes who dominate, but by ordinary acts of compassion by those who stay, who see the invisible, and who choose to stand beside the vulnerable rather than above them. In a world full of noise and inequality, quiet loyalty, shared responsibility, and silent integrity are often the strongest forces for change. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.